Good morning and welcome. My name is Elliot Whittington. I'm the Director of CLG Europe, the European Corporate Leaders Group, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our event around creating markets for climate neutral materials and the role of European industrial policy, EU industrial policy. This event is the launch of a new report that CLG Europe has developed in collaboration with and using the great skills of Agora Energiewende, which is called Tomorrow's Markets Today. Which is all about creating demand for climate neutral materials and products. And that report is something that we've collaborated on together as a kind of key topic that is not sufficiently discussed in the process of decarbonising the European economy. As Director of CLG Europe, I'm very clear that progressive businesses in their hundreds are keen to support increased climate ambition in Europe. It is very essential to both tackle the climate change, but it is also about where the future for the competitiveness of the European economy lies, where the future of many prosperous business lies as well. So it is where many businesses understand that that is the way to go in terms of innovation, new opportunity, new markets. And we see that appetite for transition, that appetite for business change extending around the world. Recently, obviously, we've had over 400 businesses write to President Biden in the US in support of a stronger set of climate targets in America, which a call which was met there. There are similar initiatives in other countries such as Japan and India and elsewhere. And so business support for climate ambition is strong and growing. And on that note, it's great to see that the European Industrial Strategy was out last week. We look forward to developing an ambitious fit between the industrial strategy and the Fit for 55% package that should be out in July, that can demonstrate European leadership and provide business with the certainty and the policy landscape required to deliver the European climate neutral future for Europe. The Green Deal, European Green Deal, provides the kind of core roadmap, if you like, to guide these conversations. So it's great to see all of these areas coming together. But the industrial sectors and the value chains that they supply will be a key part of this transition, and finding the ways to drive innovation to grow new markets for innovative and climate neutral products and industries will be key, which is why we've come together, Agora and CLG Europe, to look at this topic. We hope that the thinking that we've been able to develop will help inspire and develop new thinking both in businesses and in policymakers. And we've got a great event today. We have a number of really key conversations with presentations both from key policy makers, but also from businesses and other experts. If I just quickly run through our agenda this morning. Our first presentation will be from Dr. Patrick Reichen, the Executive Director of Agora Energiewende, who will set out the messages of this report, will talk us through the kind of key content. And then we have a keynote speech from Elisabeth Benkelmeier-Becker, Parliamentary State Secretary for the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy in Germany. Unfortunately, we were due to be joined by the Minister, Peter Altmaier, but unfortunately, with the huge developments on the German landscape in terms of having to develop a new climate law, he's been called into a number of conversations with the Chancellor and other people that require his presence. So he sends his apologies, but I'm sure we are in very good hands with the State Secretary. So that's great that she's been able to join us. I'll then move on to have a number of business reflections from key businesses that are doing innovative actions to decarbonise their sectors and their materials that they work with. So we have representatives from Unilever, from Lavage Holcim, and a recorded message from the Chief Executive Officer of Polestar. We'll have a conversation between all our kind of first set of panelists, which will be an interesting opportunity for business and policy audiences to interact. Before I hand over for the second half of the agenda, which will be chaired by CLG Europe's Senior Strategic Advisor and our Executive Chair for CISL in Brussels, Martin Porter. And Martin will bring on a number of other speakers. So we'll have the Head of Cabinet for Vice President Timmermans, Diederik Samsom, and Maria Spiriaki from the European Parliament, giving their reflections. So we'll have a couple of other kind of policy voices. And then we will go into a broader conversation with the lead author on the report, Oliver Sartor, with Lars Volkel from Stora Enso, and all of the kind of existing speakers, before Claire O'Neill, Managing Director for Climate and Energy from WBCSD, brings us together to wrap up and set a broader context and a broader kind of some jumping off points for the conversation. So hopefully you can see we've got some great conversations today. Just a little bit of housekeeping for me to share before we move into our first presentation. So the event is public, it's recorded, and we also have some media in the audience, as I understand it. So just for every speaker to be aware of that. This is a kind of broad public session. For audience members, so do feel free to use the functionality on this webinar to submit questions. They will be passed to the chairs and facilitators, and we will see if we can pick up on some of them and maybe some of the themes that people are interested in. Because of the number of speakers we've got to get through, it's unlikely that any particular question will be directly answered, but you never know. So, and we'll certainly be reflecting on the kind of things that people are interested in, and may well do a follow-up mail to the audience, sort of explaining any particular questions and connecting them with people who might be able to answer more. Do look at the handouts. So we have speaker biographies and I think the report itself in the handout. So there will also be an opportunity to kind of understand the topic through that. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm glad we've got a huge and growing audience today, and I hope you can all agree we've got a great set of speakers and we'll be on for a really interesting discussion. Without too much further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Patrick Greichen to turn his video on and join me and hand over, if you like, the floor to him to take us through the report, to tell us about the thinking that we've been doing and some of the implications and conclusions that we've been able to find. Patrick.
Yes, Elliot, thank you for handing over the mic. I'm glad we're having this event together with the Climate Leadership Group by the University of Cambridge and the Institute for Sustainable Leadership, because this is an important moment in the European legislative process. There's a huge crowd here, more than 250 attending our webinar, and it is essential that we focus on how to decarbonize industry in the process of going towards a climate neutral Europe. And it's great that we have this collaboration to really address the issue. So I would like to walk you through the report that we are publishing on both our websites. And please, next slide. What did we do? Next slide. We first had a look at where are the emissions in the industrial sector in Europe. And let's be honest, there hasn't been that much of emission reductions lately. It is a very constant trend over the past 10 years. And if you look at the 2030 impact assessment, there has been some 22 to 25% emission reduction assumed in the industry sector by 2030 to achieve the minus 55% target. And given climate neutrality 2050, we are talking about deep decarbonization in the next 30 years, so down to some minus 95 to minus 100%. So this is a totally new challenge, and this is why industry needs to be an urgent priority for European climate policy. Next slide, please. And there has been an acknowledgement of European leaders on that. The Council conclusions last December called the European Commission to propose measures that enable energy-intensive industries to develop and deploy new climate-neutral technologies, at the same time maintaining industrial competitiveness. And it's actually that gap that now needs to be filled to create lead markets for those climate neutral technologies so that there is a business case for industrial competitiveness. Next slide, please. What did we do in our project? And next slide. Well, if you look at in industry decarbonization, there are basically 3 different ways to address it. And we need to address all of them, the full value chain. So there's upstream, there's midstream, and there's downstream when you look at the industrial process. Now, upstream, this is about the availability of clean energy. It is about the infrastructure. It's about clean feedstocks. Next, and that's where the European Commission has things up and running. The Renewable Energy Directive will be part of the July package. There has been a hydrogen strategy, and we expect more to come in the gas package that comes in December. When it's about midstream, we're talking about the competitiveness of climate neutral technologies. Next, and there it is about the ETS reform. It is about the carbon leakage protection discussion, so CBAMs, but it's also about carbon contracts for difference as a new instrument to bridge the cost gap between climate neutral technologies and conventional technologies. Here we also expect an ETS reform and the CBAM proposals in July, and hopefully also at least in the framework of state aid, the option for member states to allow for carbon contracts for difference. But when we look at downstream, so how do we create markets for those new climate neutral technologies and materials? Next slide. There is a big question mark. We know that there is the Circular Economy Action Plan out there, but there is more to do there. And when you really focus at downstream, that's the next slide, there is nothing. And this study is about filling that gap, because at the end we would want the midstream processes to just be a bridge, so that finally the market demand for climate neutral technologies delivers the decarbonization of industry. But the question is, what can instruments be that really drive demand for climate neutral products and processes? Next slide, please. We therefore looked at that gap, looking at demand side policies to transition climate neutral industry. And we talked with the industry what exactly are the options for policymakers in the context of the European Green Deal. Next slide. So what is it that we were looking at? Next slide. We had intense discussions with a whole group of product producers, of basic material companies that are looking into developing climate neutral solutions. So it is really about if you're building a car and you want that car not only to be an electric car, but the steel to be green, then you need to look at the value chain and how that demand can be created. The same when you look at chemicals, the same when you look at the carbon cycle. So that's where climate neutral plastics, climate neutral steel comes into play. Next. So there are voluntary efforts out there, but there are a lot of barriers to really become climate neutral as a company. We're also not just looking at your own processes, but also when it comes to second and third scope emissions. There's a missing business case. There is the need to ramp up and scale up those climate neutral technologies. There are also lots of non-cost barriers. For example, lack of data, a risk aversion towards new materials, outdated regulations. And there are missing incentives to unlock that full set of decarbonization options along the value chain. For example, when it comes to material design, material circularity, innovative materials. So next slide, please. What we are looking at in this study is how to overcome those barriers. And it's important to note that a high carbon price is not sufficient to address those barriers. Especially if you look at standards, if you look at reporting, the carbon price doesn't really do the trick. The carbon price is good once you have different technological sets out there to change the marginal cost, to change basically the decision which type of technology to use. But when it comes to basically scaling up markets and getting the demand up, you're talking a lot about regulation and standards. Next. So what are the policy priorities? What are the options we have been discussing here? Next. Now, the first key priority is to put limit on the embedded lifecycle emissions in material-intensive final products and to reduce that over time. So going back to that example of a car, what we would want is that the embedded emissions in that car are measured, and there's a standard for that, and that standard reduces over time. And that would, of course, have impact on the steel, on the plastics that are used in that car. And therefore, it would change the value chain that is supplying that car manufacturing facility. So this is about unlocking the demand for the full set of options that are there for decarbonization. Once you have a final consumer a product standard, then the whole value chain that is supplying it can use all technological options that they have. So we are not prescribing anything that the markets could innovate. So this is the key priority, the key demand side instrument to get to have limits on those embedded CO2 emissions in the final product. Next. Now, it's important to note that this wouldn't increase consumer prices by a whole lot. For example, cement. If you say basically we want a house to be built with as little CO2 as needed, then it would mean that cement would need to have CCS, for example. CO2 need to be stored. This would increase the ton of cement maybe by 100 euro. And of course, a business that needs to compete with carbon intensive cement would have huge additional cost. So this is about overcoming that barrier, but the cost to the end consumer is just 1.7% increase in the production or the building of the house. The same applies basically to that example of steel in a car. If you consider that carbon-free steel costs some 130 euros per ton more, then this is about a 1% increase in the cost of a car. So this is not about a huge consumer extra cost. This is about getting the green premium really out in the streets, either voluntary or at the end through the standards, then mandatory for the latecomers. Next. Now, we would need the Eco-Design Directive to be implementing that. And we have the Energy Performance on Buildings regulation that will come as part of the building package in December. So these are the two European instruments that we can use for this priority number one, and it's up for the Commission to really implement that within the next months. Next. Now, the second priority in this context is obviously to have good reporting, because embedded carbon data is the key to assess basically whether or not steel is green or carbon intensive. We need transparent and comparable data for those limits on embedded carbon to work. We also need transparent and comparable data if individual companies want to become green and faster than the rest of Europe, so having that as a business model. So this is really essential that we have a standardized CO2 rating for basic materials based on a clear and transparent data instrument. Next slide, please. How do we implement that? Well, there is the EU Sustainable Products Initiative. So we could have the footprinting standards reinforced in those current product standards. We could have the construction products regulation to be innovated. So this is really about setting up a type of CO2 accounting and transparency in that context. And we've done quite some steps in that direction in other technologies. For example, when it comes to all the appliances that consume energy, and it's not rocket science to do that for basic materials. Next. The third priority is to overcome specific barriers to market entry. Now, there are lots of problems in the current system. There are different standards that make it impossible to really come up with circular material solutions. You need to overcome the cost gap between the climate neutral and the conventional technology by either carbon contracts for difference or circular material quotas or public procurement requirements. We need targeted supply and demand side policies to really overcome those barriers, time limited, so we don't want that forever, but we want to make sure that this is the direction where we're going. Next. There is the ETS Innovation Fund, where carbon contracts for difference could be placed. I also said that this could be part of the state aid regulation. Recycled materials could be under the Circular Economy Action Plan implemented. We have, of course, lots of waste legislation that is already out there. And we have public procurement requirements that can be put in place. You know that California has Buy Clean California as their policy, really ramping up green steel and green cement demand. And we could have a Buy Clean Europe approach here, driving up demand for clean basic materials. Next. So these are the three mutual reinforcing interventions that we're proposing, to have standards on the final products, to have harmonized data and reporting requirements and labeling on it, and to have early stage support for those recycled and innovative basic materials. And these are three reinforcing different options, and we need to basically have all of them so that we can really get it's up and running. Now, I see Elliot back on the screen. That kind of means that I'm running out of time. So maybe one last comment. Next slide. On the industrial strategy that the European Commission has just put forward. Next slide. Next one. We are glad that there is the strategy out there. It identifies the need for demand-side policies, but it doesn't have any concrete legislative measures out there. So everything we have been proposing here, and you saw those extra violet bullets into the presentations, that's what we need now, to really put that into legislation and not just have it as part of a strategy. We will need both. We will need regulatory limits on embedded CO2 emissions and standards to have better data. So with that, last slide, thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion with the others on the panel. Back to you, Elliot.
Thank you, Patrick. That was great. And I mean, I think hopefully the audience can see that what we've done is we have really dug into an area that doesn't get enough attention and has, because of the core economics, has a huge potential to drive change. It's an underexplored lever and a very powerful lever. But rather than just to keep us moving, given that, as I said, we have got a number of speakers, I'd like to invite the Parliamentary State Secretary for the Federal Ministry for the Economic Affairs and Energy from Germany to join us, Ms. Elisabeth Winkelmeyer-Becker. So hopefully you can put your video on and we can start to see you. Because I know, yes, brilliant. I'm so glad you're able to join us, and I'd love to hand over to you to hear your reflections on this topic and you know, the value of it, the interest of this kind of approach in terms of driving this kind of mission of decarbonisation. Minister.
Yes, Mr. Whittington. Hello to everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning from Bonn, where I'm present here. Governments across the globe are taking vigorous action to boost the fight against climate change. The US under Biden is back, China is cooperating, and Japan is in the game anyway. In the EU, which has successfully completed its trialogue procedure, the goal is to cut carbon emissions by at least 55% by 2030 and to reach climate neutrality by 2050. Encouragingly, the British G7 presidency is making a firm commitment to global climate action as it sets the stage for this year's UN climate conference in Glasgow, the COP26. Where we meet, maybe. In Germany, our Supreme Court has issued, we say, a real historic ruling, which demands that climate change mitigation should not create an excessive burden on the younger generations only. Therefore, we must and we want to speed up our climate change mitigation efforts in Germany. Tomorrow, the federal government will adopt draft legislation to revise Germany's Climate Action Act. We will tighten our climate target for 2030, and we want to achieve climate neutrality before 2050, let's say in 2045. If policy making and legislation is one side of the coin, the other side is implementation. We therefore need dedicated entrepreneurs and climate-conscious consumers. The German government is delighted that the business community, which you represent, is thinking about the needs of the world of tomorrow. This encourages us in our approach to combine economic and environmental policy. We must tackle this together, and we must not play different interests off against each other. Industrial innovation plays a key role in safeguarding our prosperity and social security. As an industrialized country, Germany gives great weight to climate change mitigation in industry. This not only applies to production processes, but also to the basic materials that are processed by industry. Considerable changes are needed. This requires a lot of research and capital. Companies and governments, particularly here in industrialized countries, have to tackle this huge challenge together. At the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, we believe that the steel industry has a key role to play. We have mobilized some 5 billion euros in Germany to promote investments in green steel. We welcome the important work done by early movers, but we need new products and production processes which will require bold and costly investments. But we cannot rely only on massive public investments with taxpayers' money. We need, therefore, innovations that are commercially viable. In the long term, the business case for investments in climate change mitigation must be driven by demand and not just by government funding. After all, climate-friendly basic materials and end products need customers. The sooner the better. We need tomorrow's markets today, and we must make this visible. Therefore, we would like to extend our special thanks to CLG Europe and Agora for publishing their study on this important issue. We welcome the fact that the study has been conducted in close cooperation with businesses and that some interesting proposals have been raised for debate. This includes, for example, the idea to put ceilings on the CO2 content of final products and CO2 labels such as those that are being used for power consumption in washing machines. In addition, there is the option of positive or negative incentives such as governmental funding or emission allowance. We have to discuss and find out which approaches are likely to have the broadest and most profound impact. But it's not only about money. With a view to promoting climate change mitigation in industry, our ministry aims, for example, to give a significant boost to climate-friendly lightweighting materials. And one way to do so is to bring stakeholders together, as you do today. Moreover, we are pursuing other promising approaches, for example, for low-carbon cement and cars made from green steel. We all know that climate change does not stop at national borders. Our ministry is therefore committed to a global approach to conceiving and creating the markets for climate-friendly products. Whoever has good ideas and the courage to put them into practice will benefit from new growth opportunities. In particular, this is how economies of scale can be achieved. And it will boost the global demand for low-carbon products and manufacturing process. The EU's Green Deal will provide great momentum in supporting the industrial transformation. Also, the European single market offers ample opportunity. Therefore, the federal government welcomes the plans of the European Commission to extend EU emissions trading to the heating and transport sectors. A fundamental concern for the Economic Affairs Ministry is to adjust the future carbon leakage protection to our increased climate ambition. We must succeed in European reforms that enable the industrial sector to invest in climate-friendly technologies here in Europe. We need a coherent overall package for the sector, a clean industry package. So the new climate targets and the ruling of our Constitutional Court and the Green Deal have built up considerable momentum. We should act quickly. This will help the climate. Also, markets always offer a first mover advantage. The Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy will be happy to work with you to develop and scale up climate-friendly products and processes. So thank you for the moment, and we see each other later on.
Thank you so much, State Secretary. That's a set of really interesting and powerful remarks. And just to state the obvious, I think I speak for a number of us to say, you know, we're very proud and impressed by the quick action of the German government in responding to that court case and raising the level of ambition to some truly impressive targets. And I think that obviously the challenge in Germany and across the EU and elsewhere is to not just set targets but to implement them, and that's why these kind of conversations are so important. So thank you very much for your keynote speech, for your introductory remarks. We really appreciate that. I'm going to move us on to hear some reflections from the business community, because as you say, that's a kind of key voice in terms of that process of implementation. And so the next speaker I'd like to invite to join us is Peter de Culver, President of Home Care, Health and Wellbeing at Unilever. So Unilever obviously has a strong track record in terms of leadership on climate change, but maybe wouldn't necessarily be seen as part of this conversation typically, but has done an awful lot of good work or good thinking recently about some of the key inputs into your products and supply chain. Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Elliot. Appreciate the introduction. Good morning. The EU aims to be carbon neutral by 2050 and reduced its greenhouse gas emission by 55% compared to 1990, already in 2030. This objective can only be achieved if the EU addresses the carbon footprint from petrochemicals, which are at the basis of almost everything in our modern life. Petrochemicals globally already account for 12% of global oil demand, and they release about 2/3 of their emissions at the end of their lives. Being made of carbon, decarbonisation is just not an option. The only way forward is carbon circularity. Europe can become a leader in carbon circularity only if it acts now. We're seeing a lot of traction for circular chemistry in other regions of the world, especially the US and China. But we need to step up in Europe. Unfortunately, the current European strategy for chemical sustainability misses a bold innovation policy and therefore misses the opportunity to stimulate the shift to circular chemistry. The new EU industrial strategy cannot not miss the opportunity to make Europe a leader in technologies such as carbon capture and utilization, catalysis and biotechnologies that underpin circular chemistry and will become staple technologies in low carbon economies. This should go hand in hand, and maybe you're surprised that a big company says that, with a carbon tax of at least $100 that will drive investments in cleaner, more efficient technologies like renewable carbon. On the demand side, 9 out of 10 European consumers want more sustainable and circular products, and we see it as our job as consumer goods companies to make it easy and affordable for them. It cannot be that sustainable products are the more expensive products. But we need some help to raise the floor in a context where good old-fashioned fossil chemistry, optimized over decades, is often cheaper. Current EU discussions on the Sustainable Products Initiative and product environmental footprinting are unmissable opportunities to accelerate the transition towards a new type of chemistry. Europe has demonstrated it can take up world leadership on technologies when it adopts a holistic policy support for such things as wind energy. This is Europe's window of opportunity for the leadership in circular chemistry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. To move on to our second business speaker, I'd love to invite Margalie Anderson, the Chief Sustainability and Innovation Officer at LafargeHolcim. So we've heard a lot from Patrick's presentation about kind of the industrial sectors, particularly including cement, and so to have a speaker from one of the more progressive leading voices in the cement sector is very welcome. It shows the breadth of business voices we've been engaging with in developing this report. Margalie, over to you.
Thank you, Elliot, and thank you for having me. Good morning, everybody. You are right, as the construction sector has been already well talked about since this morning. But let's face it, the reality is today construction projects are very much driven by traditional criteria, which is cost, liability, and safety. And that's universal across all projects. So how do we integrate the CO2 component in those projects? Last year, we launched our global brand of green concrete, first global brand, and it's called EcoPact. It's minimum 30% below the CO2, below the level of the country, all the way to 70%, and we even offer carbon neutral concrete to compensate the last 30%. So these products exist. They exist in 16 markets. Today, it will be 25 markets by the end of just before the summer. Now, is that a super commercial success? Not at all. No suspense there. There is no demand for it. And why is the reaction so timid? Is because people don't understand yet how to create added value from building carbon neutral, because there's no incentive yet. So that's why defining performance and CO2 is absolutely fundamental. And I don't necessarily mean performance at product level. So let me give you an example. It's an obvious one, but if tomorrow you are building your house, would you put single glazing windows? I assume you won't. Why? It's much less CO2 than double or triple glazing. So why would you put a single glazing? Because everyone fully understands by now that single glazing, you are going to spend more CO2, double glazing, you are going to spend more CO2 at the time of the construction. However, over the lifetime of your building, the CO2 you are going to be saving, the energy you are going to be saving in heating and so on, is fully worth that primary investment. So why don't we look at it the same way when we talk about the other construction materials, such as cement? And that's why we would need to look at CO2 per square meter of construction over the total life cycle of the building, including all the heating, etc. And today, frankly, we're not looking at it that way. There is no life cycle performance criteria. So us, the cement sector, we are completely ready to do our part. Today, as you said, we are a sector leader. We joined the Business Ambition 1.5 degree with our 2030 target validated with SBTi. But it's not just net zero. Yes, we want to bring net zero cement to the market, but what we need is truly net zero construction, and that will require a substantial amount of policy and innovation in order to make the entire ecosystem versus looking at the sector one by one. And as Patrick Gresham said so well in his introduction, it's actually not a question of cost. The total cost impact of the end customer is not going to be that great. It's going to be relatively, if you look at the pricing of the market, the evolution of the pricing market of housing, for example, this is way more than this 1 or 2% we are talking about. So there is a lot of discussion about carbon pricing, such as EU ETS, but one of the problems is we only look at the supply side, which is the manufacturing. If we really want to transition to carbon neutral economy, we need to look at carbon constraint at the level of all actors of the economic value chain. So my last point is that there is not one solution, one material that is going to provide a full answer to everything. Cement, because each country have different requirements, and cement is local and should be local. The construction material should be local. So the agenda is all about performance and about being harmonized. That we don't want member states to start defining the way they do their life cycle assessment methodology. The performance across the entire value chain should be completely harmonized across all geographies, looking at the total life cycle of the entire construction. Thank you.
Thank you, Magali. And I just particularly thank you for, I think, for underlining that key point about how much this is a value chain conversation, how much this is about making sure that if you align incentives and shift to the top of the value chain, we can get where we need to be without actually seeing significant costs for consumers, because it's much, when you go up to that level, it's much more affordable. So when we developed this report, I think it's worth saying that we looked at the 3 different sectors and their value chains. So we looked at chemicals and how that went back into plastics and packaging. We looked at cement and how that went out into construction and buildings. And we looked at steel and how that went particularly into the automotive sector. So he was very keen to join us, but unfortunately his diary didn't allow. So we have a contribution from Thomas Ingerlath, Chief Executive Officer of Polestar. Polestar, for those of you who don't know, have made a very impressive commitment recently to develop a car that is truly zero embedded emission. So there's a huge commitment there to green steel and other climate neutral materials. So we do have a video message from him, which I'd like to queue up now. And so if we can have that played now, that would be great.
My name is Thomas Ingenlath, and I am the CEO of Polestar, the Swedish electric car brand. Today, I'd like to start by telling you what we already know. We know that the world must listen to the scientists who tell us that we are not moving fast enough to combat climate change. We know we must speed up if we want to stay within the 1.5-degree target. And we know that electric cars provide a route to climate neutral mobility. But to make that happen, we must make those cars climate neutral first. Last year, we published the life cycle assessment of our all-electric Polestar 2, along with its full methodology. The data was clear. A Polestar 2 leaves the factory gate with a carbon footprint of 26 tons. If charged with green energy, that number remains broadly flat throughout the lifetime of the car. The challenge, obviously, that it presented was clear. We must remove 26 tons of CO2 from production. Last month, we announced that we are prepared to take on that challenge. We shared our moonshot goal, creating a truly climate neutral car by 2030. A car that leaves the factory gate with a carbon footprint of 0. A circular car that is powered green will have a 0 environmental impact on our planet. We choose to go out with our goal publicly to create a sense of urgency both internally and in our supply chain. We want to create an urgent demand for climate neutral materials. People ask us why we call the Polestar 0 project a moonshot goal. Honestly, it's because we literally couldn't make the car today. Amongst other challenges, we don't have access to the right kind of climate neutral materials. The LCA shows where we must focus our efforts to reach this goal. We will do this through emission reduction and not rely on offsetting mechanisms like tree planting. Between our sustainability experts, the designers and the R&D team, we drew out a roadmap with 5 key areas to focus on. One of them is climate neutral materials. As I mentioned in the beginning, time is not on our side here. We have to move fast. The keywords will be transparency and collaboration. First of all, we need a more harmonized way of measuring and reporting carbon footprint. OEMs must stop hiding behind the ISO. And when communicating footprint, it must be clear how those numbers were calculated, what method was used. Today, it is impossible to compare the CO2 footprint between different cars. Transparency is the first step towards better collaboration. Of course, collecting CO2 data takes a huge amount of work. If we had stronger regulations on CO2 reporting in the EU, we could imagine cross-industry collaboration, a case where all suppliers report it into a standard data sheet, like the IMDS. One of the big challenges is embedded emissions data, the emissions associated with raw materials, components, and sub-assemblies. This is where new technology comes in. At Polestar, we are implementing the use of blockchain to help us extract embedded emissions data in the supply chain. A blockchain-based greenhouse gas tracking solution could provide a more accurate CO2 footprint than using generic emission data. It should allow us to view the emissions that have been created as part of the production process per facility, as well as those inherited from suppliers through the supply chain. Bill Gates talks about the green premium. This is basically the difference in cost between a fossil fuel-based way of doing things and the clean, non-emitting way of doing the same thing. We need to drive the green premium down. This won't happen overnight, so we need to get started. We need to work on the policies as well as the technological and market solutions that will help make it happen. We need investments in public R&D for clean energy and incentives for the private sector to innovate in this area. Effective regulations can help the sustainable options compete on the market. For example, by putting a price on carbon-heavy solutions, like the carbon border tax on products based on their carbon footprint. If you bring a product into the EU that has a high carbon footprint, it will cost you. Setting requirements for a certain level of clean energy use is another measure that could be efficient. Together we can bring down the green premium and make clean solutions so cheap that everyone will adopt them. I'll end as I started, with a few more things that we know. I know that as a business leader, we have a responsibility to be at the front. We have to scrutinize our supply chain and ask ourselves if we are efficient in sourcing. Being part of a bigger group, we see the power of procurement and how we can drive demand and change. Instead of constantly challenging the dinosaurs to comply with our requirements, we can decide to only source from companies who can prove that they can deliver emissions-free materials. We know that we can make a measurable difference by investing in early-stage sustainable technologies. And we know that we are in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution and that businesses that don't adapt fast enough will miss the train. And at last we know, and this with certainty, that there is a strong business incentive for climate-neutral materials.
Thank you very much. And so if I can now invite our various panelists to rejoin us. So if we could have Patrick, the Parliamentary State Secretary, Peter and Margalie to all put their videos on and join me again. So we bring up the slides. Apologies for the slight bumpiness. Welcome, Peter.
Good to be here.
Welcome, Patrick. Hopefully, I know that there are a number of calls on the Parliamentary State Secretary's time, but hopefully she's still able to join us. And Margalie, great that you're here still. Brilliant. So, I mean, if it's okay, Ms. Becca, I might start with you. So you've obviously just heard not just Patrick setting out the kind of logic in the report, but also messages from this kind of sectoral diversity of businesses, all talking about the importance of this agenda. How optimistic are you that we could see more action on this kind of measure at the EU-wide or member state level?
What I think about the possibility of the labeling, was this a question?
Yeah,
yes, I think it's a good idea because we have to rely on customers who want to buy products that are greenhouse gas friendly or at zero emission. And I think that would help to ramp up a market demand side. So I think it's a good idea. It's a tool where we can bring together standardization, digitalization, and the market, the willingness of the customers to even some customers, not all at the beginning. Maybe it's some percent at the beginning, but this will ramp up. I'm convinced in this. So I think this is a good idea to make the labeling and the standardization. Yes, I think it's a good approach to this. And I'm very impressed to hear what Peter described from Unilever. I didn't hear that someone of a great great company says we want to pay 100 euro per ton of CO2. I think it's a good message from you. That's encouraging for politics to do so and to go this path. That we started in Germany with only 25 euro per ton, but we have a pathway before us, and maybe we have to increase these targets, these aims, to implement the aims, as I told at the beginning, that we want to come to stronger and ambitious targets just to 2030 and the following years, implementing the ruling of our court, who gives us these duties. Yes, we want to make it real. Yeah, not only have the targets, but to implement, to come over in reality, because it's our duty, as I think, to the younger people on the world, not only in Germany, but everywhere.
Thank you, Peter. Did you want to pick up on that kind of in terms of why is it?
I think Elizabeth is right. You know, we're in this together. It's policies, it's industries like ours, and it is the people who we serve. And you know, politicians and consumer good companies and concrete companies, we all serve the citizens of Europe. And what we now need to make sure is that we get through an initial prisoner's dilemma. We know the technology is there to decarbonize every single industry, but in the beginning there are always cheaper alternatives, and by a measure of carrot and stick we need to get the change starting. And as soon as technologies get scale, often the new technologies, the more sustainable technologies, are as expensive as the old technologies. Think about electric cars. You know, who has thought that at this moment in time, you know, it's clear where it's going to happen. It's going to be electric, a little bit of hydrogen for trucks, but the same you need to get starting in every other industry. And you know, I'm talking about chemicals. And chemicals, there is a lot of oil in the ground. When they can't put it in car anymore, they try to put it in chemicals, and they try to put it in plastic. And we should, together with policy, with industry, we should avoid that and move also these other industries forward. Otherwise, we'll never get to our decarbonization targets by 2030, let alone 2050.
Thank you. Patrick, I was really interested to hear your thoughts on some of this stuff. When we have, so we've had a few questions from the audience, I think, about this question of, you know, is there an opportunity to reduce demand for intensive materials? And I think, you know, listening to Peter, I think there's this kind of core message about the value of circularity. How do we strike the right balance between the incentives for innovating production, the incentives for reducing demand for, or being more efficient with materials, and the incentives for circularity?
Well, I think that's the beauty of having carbon standards on final products, because then essentially it is for the whole value chain to come up with solutions. And those solutions can either be to have carbon-free processes, so it would still be plastic, but carbon-free plastic, or it would be an alternative material. It doesn't need to be plastic. It could also be some type of paper or whatever to pack the different products. So I think that's exactly where we need to look at. If we have final product standards, then either Magali will produce a carbon-free cement, or it will be wood in the house, but at the end, it is clear the house is built carbon-free. And I think it's that type of way of thinking that we now need to establish, and where we need the European Commission to propose those standards.
Magali, you talked a lot about the importance of recognizing the local production, the local context in terms of construction materials, but also obviously there's a value if we're creating these demand measures that they are ones that have scale, that they are able to kind of shift large scale markets. Are those kind of two challenges compatible? Can we make sure that we have an incentive that operates across the whole EU, that is, common systems, common transparency, and still have that kind of localization, that local different approaches working locally?
No, absolutely. The products we make them everywhere. That's why I was mentioning our Eco Pact, which is now in 16 countries, soon to be in 25. So it is everywhere. But back to the topic, I think it's all about performance. It's all about rewarding performance. So I don't mind today I'm rewarded in the amount of concrete I sell. So the more concrete I sell, the better. But if I go back to what was just said, I don't actually want to be paid by the amount of concrete I sell. I'd rather be paid for the total house, a net zero house, which would have less concrete, but then we would be rewarding performance. So it's absolutely not incompatible at all. It's not incompatible with the circular economy, which is the same thing. I'd rather reuse materials than getting virgin resources out of the ground. But the way the legislation is made today, I'm not being incentivized to do that. So if I do that, it's going to cost more, which if you think about it, is mad. Concrete is infinitely recyclable. So at the end of the life of a building, you can take the concrete, grind it back, put it straight back in the cement. We do that with our cement called Susteno in Switzerland, which contains 20% of construction demolition waste. Why I only do it in Switzerland? Because there is no other countries that allows this norm. It's the same cement, it's the same strength, but I can't do it in other countries. So today, we can go way further if we have the legislation being incentivizing circular economy and low carbon.
It feels like one of the kind of key threads of this is about innovation, and obviously Magali is a Chief Innovation Officer, but it feels like it's a big piece in terms of how do we innovate not just the production and the products, but also the markets themselves, the building materials. Maybe it's good to take that one. Peter, you had a comment on that.
Yeah, I think Magali has a really important point to make. I think in general, the public is there. When the quality is the same, the price is the same, it's a nice and easy transfer. When you say, okay, I have now a building and it is weaker and it is more expensive, you get a couple of nutcases who will still buy into that, but not most people. And so, I think the policy framework we need to build around dematerialization, because often we can build things, whether that is consumer goods or whether that is houses, with much fewer molecules. And I think that is the easiest saving that we can make. And the second one is push everything to circularity by also taxing the externalities of the alternatives, because many in our high fossil carbon economy, many of those externalities are not taxed. So there is no fair competition for the or the circular carbon products. And Patrick, wood is also carbon. So whether you put wood in or concrete, in the end, everything is carbon. The question is, do we take the right type of carbon? Yeah.
Very good. I mean, that point about externalities is a good bridge to go back to Elizabeth, if I can call you that. We had a question from the audience about expanding the ETS to the building sector, which is something you talked about, and whether that will just pass costs on to consumers, onto households, without having the levers, if you like, to take low carbon choices. How do you see that an expanded carbon price and expanded price working in other sectors?
Yes, that's a problem. How do we have to refinance these costs? Those who was ist denn jetzt Mieter?
Tenant.
Bitte?
Landlord and tenant.
Okay. So we have to distribute the additional costs between those two parties, and that's quite a problem, because the one is reliable and decides about the infrastructure and how with which technology we are heating. Do we have double or glasses, or only one glass in the window? And the other decides whether he opens the window and how warm rooms should be. And those, in this way, both are reliable and decide about how much oil, gas, or whatever is used to the heating is to be consumed. And both are deciding about the emissions that exist. And we have to find a system that addresses both sides. Yeah. But this is an unfinished discussion at the moment. We have to find a solution in the next weeks.
Do you think an EU buildings framework regulation could help solve some of those questions at the pan-European level?
Yes, higher regulation or a stronger regulation firstly means or leads to a higher price for new buildings, and yeah, it's always the question who pays for this, the one who builds or the one who lives in the building. And I think for some time we have to divide the amount. Everybody has to pay 50%, but in the end, I think the market should find the solution, and everybody who decides to live in an old house with lower fees has to think it over and to calculate that the price and the amounts for heating are higher than in a modern house. Yeah. And I think this will be the market to find the regulation and the solution.
Thank you. Patrick, I was going to come to you on the question of innovation, and anyway, and particularly your thoughts on the balance between measures to support innovation in the supply side and the demand side. But also, just as a kind of trailer, the other question that I've opened to anybody in the audience who wants to pick it up is we had a question from the audience about the role of CCUS and whether there should be more measures to support that as a particular solution. So I'm not particularly directing that last one at you, but be interested if anybody has any particular comments on that. But Patrick, over to you on the role of innovation.
Well, as Peter has said, there are lots of technologies already out there that are carbon free. And we are progressing at very high speed here with lots of carbon neutral solutions. For example, in the steel sector, some 3 years ago, there were lots of different options out there. Now it's very clear it's going to be direct reduction iron manufacturing that is going to be the technology to choose. And similar when it comes to other sectors in cement, we know it's going to be CCS for at least large part, and the other part is circular economy, as Magali has said. And in the chemical sector, we're talking about electric steam reformers and options there. So I think we are experiencing an explosion of innovation here, and they all need to somehow now bridge that cost gap. and it's exactly that what policy and regulation now needs to be for, to create that market for the zero carbon alternative, and to basically address the full value chain to get that up and running. And just wanted to highlight also what Elizabeth was saying in the beginning. This is now something that's going to happen everywhere in the world. I mean, the Biden administration is moving ahead at a speed none of us would have expected. And this is also about which industry, which continent is moving fast enough on those new materials and processes. So I'm not worried about innovation. I'm worried about fast deployment of those innovations, and there I kind of have the little hesitant feeling that the Commission is not yet at that level of speed that we would need.
Thank you, Patrick. I mean, we're neatly being teed up for our next panel, and we've already got one of our next panelists joining us. So it's a prompt for us to kind of wrap this up. Maybe if I could just have some last thoughts from Peter, Magali, and Elizabeth in turn, and then I'll hand over to the next panel. Peter.
You know, when you're in business, you always look to the next innovation frontier, and I think decarbonization, total biodegradability, these are all innovation axes. And when we can leverage the scale of Europe, which is still phenomenal, then we can build new industries built on new science and new technology at scale, and we continue to be an economic force in this world. But you know how the Chinese are plotting and how Biden is now leading it. Patrick is absolutely right. This is the moment.
Magali.
So I think on the topic of innovation and being Chief Innovation Officer, obviously, I love that topic, but we don't have time. We have to start running now. So we need first to change the market with our current solutions, which will take us for the next 5 to 10 years to the speed we need, as Patrick was mentioning. But then innovation is important for the next phase. For CCUS, we need all the infrastructure at European level to help us doing CCUS, because we will need it past 2030. So I think sitting back in our office and waiting for innovation is not the solution. We need to run now with what we have, while we put all our effort in innovation to accelerate even further once it's ready, because at the end, as it was said, and I can only agree with that, innovation is fantastic. Scaling innovation in all our countries, in all our cement plants, is going to take a long time. So we can't just sit down and wait for that. We need to do both at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. And over to the Parliamentary State Secretary, just some final remarks from you, and thank you so much for joining us, for giving your keynote speech, and for being part of this discussion. But any final reflections from you?
Yes, I think we have to move forward very fast, much faster than we thought some years ago. But we have challenges before us. That means risks and opportunities. And we have to make it an opportunity, even an economical opportunity, because the first one who finds the solutions, the breakthrough technologies, will have the opportunity to earn money with this. And that's what we as an industrialized country want to do as well. And we want to have good jobs for our people here, and to keep the society together. Yeah, that's not easy standing before these huge challenges, but that's what we have to find solutions for. And so I think we are going to have an election before us, and we have to discuss who has the best solutions for this. I hope my party will be a part of this. Don't want to discuss this, but I think we should look at the opportunities. We have some experience with how to implement e-mobility. We pay a huge amount for everyone who buys a car now, but we have an egg and chicken problem with the infrastructure. Who begins first? The OEMs who product these cars, or the customers who want to buy this, but have to pay more than they can. So how can we bring this together? This will be the problem, and we have to find solutions. And I think the proposals that you lay on the table here are very good, and we have to look at this and find the combination between incentives and subsidies and market instruments and all this, just to reach to carbon neutrality and to fulfill the Paris commitment.
Thank you so much.
Let's do it.
Let's do it, exactly. Thank you so much, and we're very grateful for you joining us, particularly given that you were asked to join us at relatively short notice, given the Minister's prior commitments. So thank you very much for the panel that I've been able to share. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Martin Porter, who is our Senior Strategic Advisor and Executive Chair in Brussels. And I think myself, Patrick, and the State Secretary are going to leave you for in the second round of conversation that Martin's going to chair. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Elliot. Thank you to everybody, and I hope that Magali and Peter, even if you're off screen, you will stay on in case we have other questions. I can.
Will do.
Where the handover doesn't. I'm not sure if others have got the same problem I've got, but I'm not hearing Martin's voice.
I hope you can hear me.
Yes, sounds better now.
Okay, very good. And Diederik Samsom, who is the head of cabinet of the first vice president of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans. The two need very little introduction, I'm sure, because I'm sure you're well aware of all of the activities they're involved in. And we're going to simply ask each of you, I'll start with Diederik and then turn to Maria, to give us your reflections on the report, which I hope you've had a chance to look through, and make any other comments in relation to that and the discussion we've just heard a little bit about, linking this to industrial strategy, actually, which obviously the European Commission has also recently updated its approach on. So with that, we have limited time, so I'll pass first of all to you, Diederik. Welcome, thank you very much for joining us, and look forward very much to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Because I had to crack a few firewalls in order to get here, but I am in, thank you. So yeah, let me give you my reflections, and basically it boils down to one outcry that we get from industry all the time, and that's also reflected in the report. And that basically comes down to the fact that the industry tells us, as let's say legislative body, that yes, we can redirect our investments, yes, we can innovate, but we need a clear signal as to where we are going. That's the single thing you have to provide to us. Sounds like a simple plea, but it's rather complicated. So let me outline what we have been doing so far and what we will do in the near future in order to provide that clear direction. We started the mandate, the von der Leyen Commission, with a clear objective to reduce our CO2 emissions by 2030 with between 50 and 55%, which is not very clear yet, but it was the first move of the needle. And then we went to work. We made a very thorough impact assessment on whether 50 or 55 would bring us closer to the trajectory towards the climate neutrality in 2050, which is actually the ultimate goal. 2030 is just a milestone on the way. But still, so we had to define the exact point where we think we need to be as a union in 2030, and whether we can be at that point. An impact assessment has to assess all the impacts, including social and economical and financial, and see whether this is possible. And the answer was pretty clear. It is possible, 55%. And actually, it's also needed. You can't afford to go for a lower ambition in order to stay on the slope towards climate neutrality in 2050. A 50% ambition would be way too low. So that's step one, or step two, after the introduction of the 50 to 55 target. Step three was enshrining that into law, talking about giving clear directions, enshrining your target into a climate law that binds the EU as a whole to this milestone is I would say the mere definition of giving clarity on where we're going. So we designed a climate law. And in the meantime, something happened. A detail, or not, the Corona crisis turned our world upside down, obviously. And for a moment, I must admit, I despaired a little, because we've been there before, when politicians finally mustered the courage and had the audacity to put a dot on the horizon and say, yes, this is the direction where we're going. And you hear industry having a sigh of relief. Oh, finally, we know that's the direction they're going. And then all of a sudden, something happens, something urgent, coming by, requiring all your political capital, all your attention, and off the horizon. It's gone. And the plan goes in the lowest drawer you can find. And that was a risk for the climate law, for the Green Deal as a whole. But fortunately, we were able to turn things upside down, and it didn't happen. So it didn't end up in the lowest drawer we could find. No, the opposite happened. We put the Green Deal on steroids. And that's pretty relevant, because next to a climate law and an ambition, we also have now our investment package of 1.8 trillion euros to get the European economy back on track, but on a different track, back on track towards a sustainable future. A 1.8 billion euro investment package to make the future happen. As I said, not planned, but well, not a small detail in our course towards the future. A climate law is an important step, but doesn't tell you how you're going to get to 55% and further to climate neutrality. So that's what we're doing right now, designing. And so we have adopted the climate law, quite some discussions with European Parliament, as is usual, and needed and enshrined in their treaties. So we're happy to do so. And I'm happy that this morning or yesterday, the ENVI Committee of Parliament voted in favor of the climate law, and we hope that that will be repeated in plenary somewhere at the end of June. It's a formality, but a very important one for history. But now the real work starts. Translating your policies into something that brings us to minus 55 requires the so-called Fit for 55 package, which is not a Jane Fonda video for middle-aged man to get yourself to a fitness at 55 of age, but it is our European plan to put us on that track towards 55% CO2 emission reduction. It requires adapting the ETS, the emission trading system. It requires adapting the effort sharing regulation. It requires adapting the land use and land use change and forestry. It requires adaptation of the renewable energy strategy. It requires 12 legislative proposals that are all intertwined and have relations with all the others in order to make this happen. It's like solving a 12-dimensional Sudoku, which is actually humanly not possible. But designing policy is possible, and we are doing it, and we will present that to the world at mid-July. And does that answer the question from industry? Please provide us direction. My answer to that will be yes, it is. And it is, and already now industry knows that this will happen, and you see the outside world adapting to it. So you see that this is not just theory. Politicians designing new legislation, new policy, and industry adapting to it. It's happening in real time. Look at where the CO2 price is at the moment. That is in anticipation of what is coming, and we hope it will go even further. That's not only a good news story. a higher CO2 price also is a challenge, because pushing a higher CO2 price all the way down the value chain towards the consumer, not every consumer is able to accommodate that. Not every consumer has the same possibilities, abilities, and the same size of its wallet to accommodate for that higher price. So we need to also adapt our social policies within the Fit for 55 package, making it much more than just an environmental plan, in order to create a just transition, to enable everyone, every family, every region, every city, every country to go along on this incredible journey. And actually, we need to do more than that, because Europe is 10% of the CO2 emissions. So we also need to take care that the rest of the world joins the same endeavor towards -55 and climate neutrality. Very relevant for industry that competes in a global environment. So here we are with our CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, one of the 12 proposals, in order to create a level playing field with the rest of the world, but not on the lowest level possible, as we did so far with free allowances, but on the highest level possible, as we will do with a Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And also there you can see that things are working, things are happening. We are talking and we're having conversations with the US on the possible ramifications of such a CBAM and the possibilities of the US to do the same in order to avoid a Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism when exporting their stuff to Europe. And we're actually having the same conversations on a different level, because it's preliminary with other countries. So things are happening at a mind-boggling speed, I would say. And now it's up to industry to start investing. And they're already doing it, but we need to step up to the plate. We need to step up our game, increase the ambition, increase the investments, and we are going to provide help for that, both on the supply side and, as is relevant for this session, also for the demand side of it. Let me give you 2 examples to conclude. On the supply side, we are working within our emission trading system to develop proposals to create possibilities for a carbon contracts for difference incentive mechanism, paid for by the innovation fund that is filled with the revenues from the emission trading system. So one system that pays itself. And with those contracts for difference, we could provide help to clean steel, competing with dirty steel, or clean cement, competing with dirty cement. The contract for difference is actually paying for the difference in prices. And hopefully that difference gets smaller and smaller. First of all, because of the CO2 price itself. Secondly, because of innovation. And we hope that clean steel made with hydrogen or other innovative techniques will bridge the gap as soon as we can. Hydrogen is an essential part, but I lack the time to talk about that. We could have a whole seminar on such a thing. Yeah. But on the demand side, it's a similar issue. It's a bit different, and I must admit that the European Commission concentrates more on the supply side of stuff than on the demand side of stuff. But for instance, let me give you one example: public procurement. Governments, public entities are the biggest consumers in the world. They buy the stuff. We buy most pencils in the world, but also bigger machinery and stuff. And we can have our public procurement rules, we can make them greener. We can oblige governments on every level to take the environmental considerations into account, or actually to put them front and center of our public procurement work. And that hasn't been done so far. That will be necessary in the future. So that, for instance, the bodies that pay for the roads, which are public bodies most of the time, buy the cement and the concrete from a greener level, on a greener level than we have done so far. And that will be a huge incentive to the demand side for those new cleaner products. So in conclusion, we are working towards that Fit for 55 package, providing full clarity on the direction, and the direction is clear. It's an irrevocable pathway towards a full climate neutral future. and industry can embark on that pathway if they want to, and most of them want to. And as soon as they do, we will try and provide all the incentives and help that is needed to get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diederik. I'll come back to you after we've heard from Maria, in particular about whether you think the new updated industrial strategy is doing enough to drive that agenda, as well as the Fit for 55 program in itself. But first of all, Maria, welcome. Looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. So please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me in this very, very interesting seminar. And of course, we all agree that we need to create transition pathways for our industrial ecosystems, because it is important to have a bottom-up approach in terms of the scale of the cost of the long-term benefits and condition required to action to accompany the twin transition, the digital and green transition. And in this regard, I would like to go fast to the policies that we have to explore and maybe trying to implement as fast as we can, starting with the unlocking abandonment incentives along the value chain. And second, improving the product abandonment, the greenhouse gas emission data, availability and comparability, which is so important as well. And a lot of speakers, the previous speakers has already focused on it. It is also important to overcome the market entry barriers to circular or innovative materials. I think it is one of the main obstacles that we face in order to increase the demand for circular materials, and also to ensure that actions to address this need is aligned throughout the whole value chain. And by saying this, it has been already mentioned that we have a lot of new and maybe updated legislative proposals that the Commission will forward. It is the Eco-Design Directive, it is the Construction Product Regulation, it is also the energy performance of building that we are waiting by the end of the year. And the limits of the embedded life cycle CO2 emission must be applied in a manner that is consistent with attempts to minimize operational emissions from finite projects such as cars, such as building. And by saying this, I would like to say that we have to focus on building on new alliance. We have to keep the tradition that we have in alliance, and we have to build upon new alliance like the alliance on space launches and also the alliance on zero emission aviation, which is so important concerning the replacement of the old-fashioned fossil fuels in the aviation sector. And allow me to focus just on three aspects that it is affecting the industrial strategy. And the first one is the affordability of the energy. We have to take into account that we need a lot of hydrogen, green hydrogen is the very first priority, but 2024 is tomorrow. And in this regard, I think that we have to take into account the use of low carbon hydrogen, and of course by using low carbon hydrogen, we have to implement all the available technology we have on CCS and CCU. In this regard, we have to provide secure and safe solutions to our citizens, because one of the main issues we face on the implementation of CCS and CCU, not only in industrial hubs but also in the cities, is the public acceptance and the concerns that it is affecting on the security issue. The second issue that I would like to focus on is the infrastructures. And I think that the revise of the TEN regulation must be a tool, an instrument for facilitating member states to encourage hydrogen-ready investments for a smooth transition, because we need a smooth transition into zero carbon energy mix, and we need to facilitate the end user, consumers, and the industry as well. And the third issue is concerning the image or the vision that we have in our minds when we are crafting, drafting, and finally vote for the legislation that it will be applied horizontal to the whole continent. It is the question if we want to be leaders or we want to be followers in this transition. And the answer is that we have to put Europe back in the driving seat, as Commissioner Breton has already said. And by saying this, I think that I have to focus on just on two very short proposals. The first one is by developing global standards, by starting standardizing rating system for embedded CO2 performance emission in basic materials, such as steel, such as cements, as aluminium, such as plastics. It is very important for the market, and it is also a leading movement. And the second one is how can we overcome market barriers, as I have already mentioned. I think that where market entry barriers exist for certain solutions, such as of market distortions from technology-specific support, allow certain demand guarantees may be temporarily justified to set minimum contents quota for innovative climate neutral market or circular materials. And in this regard, we can create lead markets. And by saying this, I would like once again to thank you very much for having me. I would like to focus on this. We have to have a coordinated action across the EU. We have to overcome different approaches within member states, of course, by respecting subsidiarity. And we have also to have a pan-European industrial companies and value chains. And this is one of the elements that we have to focus. Thank you very much once again.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Well, I think you've both picked up on some of the elements in the report, notably creating markets that can drive demand for these climate neutral materials. Since you mentioned, Maria, as well, the need for business and global businesses to be involved in this, we're lucky to have Lars Volkel from Stora Enso, who can join us now and give us a perspective from a different value chain to the ones we've already had presenting to us. And to give us a reaction to what he says, and then also to turn to Oliver, who's one of the authors of the report, to likewise pick up on a couple of the other points that you've made before I come back to you and others with other questions, if I hope we have time. But Lars, with that, I shall be brief. The floor is yours. I look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, everybody. So firstly, it's great to see that amount of energy by both the policymakers and the other companies, and we share that, of course, because we are a renewable materials company. And a little bit to reflect on Peter's point before, yes, cement and wood both contain carbon, but we are a renewables materials company. And a little bit what I'd like to talk about today is that we as a renewable materials company need to move forward, not just from tree hugging and pure environmental arguments, but more also the financial benefits to create that demand, which that report really is about. I have a lot of support for the arguments made by Magali about the standardization and the measurements. I'd like to add a point to that as well, which is the importance of not only stick to the measurements for the materials, which of course need to contain, full life cycle view, embodied carbon and so forth, but they need to also look at the applications of the materials. So exactly what Magali said, so that we look at the building and to also provide a reference value to those buildings, so we can actually have a meaningful benchmarking of a full building performance and not just the material. When it comes to us moving from being tree huggers as one of the largest private forest owners to moving more into also financially relevant demand creating wood construction partners, firstly, we see a true big responsibility here. Construction materials alone stand for 11% of the global CO2 emissions. There's a huge area of opportunity. However, the construction market is highly fragmented, super regulated, and very, risk averse when it comes to change. So I think we can put a lot of policies in place, but to get, to Sudoku's examples of Diederik, right, to get through those building regulations is a huge challenge, right? And they have been designed on the past, not the future. We have to also, as a company ourselves, do more to create that demand, not just to blame the building regulations or the missing standards. One of the things we need to do as Stora Enso, for instance, is to provide more financial arguments. Argue that you can save logistics costs because wood is lightweight. Argue that also the construction costs can be reduced because we can prefabricate. And to the very initial comments that Patrick made about increasing or justifying that 1% of price difference for buildings, we can also argue that living and working in a wooden building significantly increases your well-being and productivity. So that can also justify a high sales price. We can also achieve a higher floor space on a given footprint. So all of these arguments need to become more relevant for us as tree-hugging renewable materials companies, which we need to help to create that demand. One last joint challenge that I see for all of us is to also create competence in this industry for wood construction specifically. We are lacking interest and number of colleagues and interested talents to go into mass timber engineering, to move from today's traditional construction work to the future way of construction. So investment into education is also very, very much important here. So to summarize, we very much welcome this report. We also take our responsibility to make sure that the demand is created by also providing not only environmental benefits, which are obvious, but also financial benefits. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. And indeed, before you go, if I can just follow up on one question we've had from the audience, how do we also ensure that the demand is respectful of biodiversity and other environmental issues at the same time? Because clearly there's a great interest in these products, these materials. What are your quick views on that before I pass over to Oliver, if I may?
Yeah, so this is the one thing we cannot find a quick fix for. Firstly, I guess we know that in Europe the forest space has increased. We also as Stora Enso, we always grow and seed more than what we harvest. So overall, we're actually investing into not only the size of the forests, but also the biodiversity within. We fully support the EU's focus on biodiversity. However, we can't also, if the industry was to change much quicker to wooden buildings, we can't also find a quick fix to supply more and more wood for that need. Actually, the main difficulty is actually, in my eyes, not the forest and the wood supply, it's also the ability to provide those wood components with engineered wood solutions. So we are still lacking production capacities for instance, cross-laminated timber, which is a key element to generate this and supply for this demand. So it's of course linked, and therefore we can't just speed up and disregard biodiversity, but we also need to invest into engineered wood capabilities.
Great, thank you very much. Oliver, I'm going to turn to you now, and maybe just to go back to the the underlying rationale for the report as well. The price of the of carbon in the ETS now is over 50 euros per ton. Basic question we get asked is, why do we need all of this other demand-led materials action if the carbon price is rising? Will it not do the job on its own? So do you want to remake that case briefly?
Sure, thanks, Martin. It's a good question. I mean, the carbon price is obviously one important component of the transition, as Diederik Samson mentioned, and obviously the ETS is an important part of the overall policy package. But I think what we're saying in the report is that the industry transition is complex. It's like the way Patrick presented in his presentation earlier, that you have sort of the upstream kind of infrastructure and raw materials. You have the midstream sort of technological transition that needs to happen, and then you have the downstream sort of creation of markets and incentives for material efficiency and circular economy. And so if we only focus on carbon pricing, where we may be missing specific barriers to each of those areas, right? So it's very important, I think, that we have a coherent package that integrates carbon pricing. So things like carbon contracts for difference, as Mr. Samson mentioned, can be, I think, a very good complement to carbon pricing. But fundamentally, one of the things that came through from speaking to all these different companies when researching the report is, that the companies would say, but there's, ultimately what we need is to remove a bunch of non-price barriers to the transition. So, for example, Magali Anderson talked about the fact that they can't sell recycled concrete in the EU because of concrete standards, or the fact that the construction sector, as Lars mentions, is conservative or resistant to certain new materials. So there's these other barriers that I think have to be addressed as well. And fundamentally also, one of the things we need to do is you have very complex value chains that need to be coordinated. So for example, and they don't always see the carbon price. So for example, one key option to decarbonize buildings, as we've said, is to design the building in a way that is much more efficient and circular in its use of resources. But the actual engineers that design the building, they don't see the carbon price. The carbon price comes at the point where the construction company chooses which materials to use. So you therefore need these other complementary policies to unlock the full set of abatement incentives that we need to actually get to that very ambitious net zero goal. So I think that's why we see this as a need for a coherent and full package.
Great, thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to check whether Peter and Magali are still available. If so, I put one last question to them before turning back to Diederik and Maria for some final comments. If Magali, a question for you in relation to what has been said about first mover advantage, Europe leading the way in this area. How useful would it be for you for them to lead the way in setting these standards and regulation on CO2 content in products and processes, performance standards, as a means of driving this demand out of Europe and globally for a company like yours?
I think it's more than useful. It's critical. I don't know if I have a stronger word for that. It's necessary because, I mean, I can put together all the slides and the pledges, anything you want. At the end of the day, if I don't sell my low carbon concrete or my low carbon cement, then I haven't achieved anything. We have to move now. It would be criminal not to move today. So for me, I mean, it's not a question of who is leading. The entire industry has to move together, and the entire industry will move together if the demand is there. There is absolutely no question about it. But without the demand, what we are doing is just a nice talk in nice panels, nothing else.
Okay, well, let's make sure we don't just do that in this case, even if it is a nice talk in a nice panel. So maybe just final remarks maybe to both Maria and Diederik before I turn to Claire. What should the new industrial strategy that you'll be commenting on in the Parliament, Maria, and Diederik, you've published, but which Oliver and Patrick both said could be stronger in driving this agenda. What would you want to see happen over the coming few months with respect to that strategy in particular, as a result of what you've heard today on this discussion?
Who is answering first? It's me.
To Maria first.
Oh, yes, okay. Well, once again, thank you. The debate was very interesting, and I would like just to focus on two issues on the implementation of the new strategy. The first one concerns the issue of the chemical industry. And I think that it is now the time to implement all different technologies we have available in order to facilitate the chemical industry for having a low carbon by design products, to have sustainable chemicals by design. I think this is one of the main priorities we have to focus on in order to start setting at the global level the standards. It is very ambitious, but I think it is achievable if we start with implementing all the available instruments we have. And the second issue is the engagement of the consumers. And it is also important for me. I think that the member states and the Commission and all the European institutions, but I insist that everything is local. I think that the member states and the regional governors, they have started to engage people with the low carbon products and policies. And this is important. It must be linked with the funding and the implementation of our new policies when it comes to MFF and to RRF and to additionality that we are trying to provide and to proceed. So I think these are two parameters we have to focus on the framework of the industrial policy and the industrial strategy.
Wonderful, thank you. And Diederik, just one other question that's also come up from the audience is, how do we best set key performance indicators for climate-related innovation? When we're talking about industrial strategy, a lot of it turns on incentives for innovation. How would you like to see that progress, in addition to the broader implementation of the strategy?
Yeah, first of all, it sounds strange, but I might agree that with the fact that the industrial strategy can be stronger on climate innovation. But that's actually true every time of the year. And so we can always be a bit stronger on how we focus our energy and our policy and our innovation towards that single goal, which is a fully sustainable future. I do think that, for instance, let me give you one example, the automotive ecosystem, or how you want to, the automotive industrial cluster. What's happening there is very interesting and might be a blueprint for other sectors and other industrial clusters. And we're not talking about a small piece of our industry here. It's by far the biggest of all. And what you see happening now in that whole value chain is that CEOs of those companies have, as if they had a sneak preview in the future, they saw it, and they now are basically, you could say they're almost panicked, and they're now throwing their whole kitchen sink towards changing that sector. And what we need to do is help them to comply with all the new realities of a fully electrical drivetrain for personal mobility, which is charging infrastructure, for instance, that we need to provide for, but also the skilling of labor. That is a huge challenge to all of us. So what I do think is that in the best possible industrial strategy, this happens to every sector. So the fast change, and you could almost say the pivotal change of cores of several industries that haven't changed that much in the last 100 years, to be frank, and now all of a sudden make a 90 degrees or even a 180 degrees turn, and we have to be there as governing bodies, European, but also national and regional level, to accommodate those changes, because alone they will get stuck. They won't find the labor, they won't find the market surroundings in order to make this happen. And that's where the industrial strategy can be a bit stronger on, well, you could say almost all of the sectors that we are talking about.
Thank you. Well, I think you can trust on us and many others to give you input to strengthen it further, which I'm sure we will be doing collectively over coming weeks and months. And indeed, the discussion we've had on this report suggests the huge market opportunities that exist, not just in Europe, if we can create the demand, but globally, if the EU leads that process. First mover advantage was mentioned several times. So competitive sustainability is the term I think the Commission is starting to use for this now. So with that, I'm going to thank all of my panelists and colleagues for their time. Very precious, much appreciated you joining us today. Thank you and wish you very well in your rest of your days. Turn over now to Claire O'Neill, who is going to talk to us about what we have learned, and indeed the bigger picture, I guess, in relation to the run-up to the COP towards the end of the year, and how this relates to that agenda. So Claire, welcome, and the floor is yours. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for actually getting this together and focusing on these incredibly important issues. A really rich and thoughtful set of conversations, and extremely timely given our challenges. And I thought a couple of things that were really worth drawing out. One was the focus across different materials. You know, we often talk about this question of materials and sustainability, looking purely at the built environment, and we did do that today, but we also considered very much the whole supply chain across a whole series of materials, from woods to plastics, etc. And the other thing that I thought was fascinating was that there's a really renewed sense of confidence, I think, amongst particularly EU policymakers to lead global policy in this area, which is unbelievably welcome. We obviously very much agree and support the findings of the report, but one thing that occurred to me was perhaps sometimes the conversation is portrayed a bit as an either-or scenario. It is either regulation or it is demand creation, or it is companies essentially coming together to innovate. And actually, it is a both and solution to this problem. We clearly need regulation. We heard again and again how important it was to have clarity of labelling, of standards, of taxonomy when it came to low carbon materials. And of course, regulation, frankly, has been what has driven this extraordinary change in the carbon price, now starting to approach levels that, for example, correspond to what the UK government uses in its Treasury analysis of overall carbon pricing. And that was a regulatory construct. But we also need business cooperation and business transparency. We can't wait for global standards to be agreed and set. And I think, as some of the speakers were saying, so much of these market pull factors are local. And we know that trying to agree a set of global standards can be very, very long term. So having businesses come together in fora like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, where I now lead the Climate and Energy Programme, and work to the highest possible voluntary standards that can then be codified by regulators is one way to overcome that. But the other thing I think that came through very strongly was this enormous opportunity to create a really strong demand pull now, both from the private but also from the public sector. And I wanted to just make 3 sets of final remarks. The first is around this value chain cooperation, which sounds great, but we know we have had relatively few examples of value chains coming together to share, for example, information about scope 3 emissions, to create both a protocol for data sharing, but also a data lake, if you like, for that data to be safely kept and shared. And it's been fantastic to see, first of all, the work of Mission Possible in pulling together sectors to have those conversations via the Mission Possible partnership, but also the work of teams like mine at the WBCSD, who are building a carbon transparency partnership. And really good to hear from Unilever today, who've been a founder member of that, sharing scope 3 emissions data, being able to create a really strong understanding of what emissions look like up and down the value chain. And of course, also at WBCSD, we have the circular economy and built environment work, where Lafarge, who are very eloquent on this, are a key member. But when it comes to pull factors, I don't think we should underestimate the power of consumers. It was really interesting to hear conversations around the green premium and how small that is at the consumer level. And by consumers, I mean both, people, but also companies who might potentially be purchasing green building materials. We're really starting to get to a point where those price points are not a barrier to adoption. And indeed, many consumers are now wanting actively to be participating in buying these materials. But I've been fascinated by the regulatory shift that is driving the public sector to be a major demand pull. We've seen regulations, particularly in the US, where there's been some fantastic state-by-state regulation mandating that public sector procurement must be associated with low carbon green building materials, and that has been great to see. And I suppose I wanted to draw to a final thought, which is, what is the role of COP and what is the role of policymakers? I personally think that the incredible power of the EU Green Deal and the policymakers in the EU will have major long-term impacts on so many parts of this transition, from hydrogen to investment in additional renewable materials, to grid creation, to innovation in these low carbon materials. But we have this major moment, don't we, coming up in November, the COP moment, where so much will be put on the table, not necessarily in the negotiations, but in the ecosystem around it. And the thing I took away most, and I think this was said very well by one of the speakers, is we do need to focus. I think sometimes we're in danger of trying to solve a multivariate equation for the whole system to draw through these lower carbon materials. And actually, if we focused in on one or two sets of materials, were very clear about what the policy and advocacy asks were, and took those to the COP26 as a unified set of asks, for example, from businesses to governments, then I think we would make much more rapid progress than trying to solve all of these agendas at once. So in summary, let's cooperate as businesses, let's use the strength of the policy making machines, both to set these directions of travel and taxonomies, but also to provide a really strong pull factor. And let's use this proof point moment of COP to really advance the agenda on one or two fronts, knowing that that will pull forward a much broader and better result. Sorry about the technical problems, Elliot, but thanks so much for having me.
It was well worth waiting for. Thank you so much for your contributions. And I'm very grateful to our audience for sticking a little bit beyond our advertised end time, but because we seem to have kept people, so that's great stuff. I'm not going to extend this much further, but just to say thank you everyone for all your contributions. It's been a fascinating set of conversations, and I don't think there's a much better final remark than the remark made by the Parliamentary State Secretary, which was, we just need to get on with it. Let's move forward and let's get it done. Thank you, everyone. It's been great.
Thanks all.